We are going to begin, inshallah.
You go
Bismillah
ahead.
ar-Rahman.
You go ahead.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Professor Abdulaziz Barghouth, Professor Dato Osman Bakar, Professor Fatih Amal Kawi, colleagues, students, and friends. We are live now on Zoom and also on ISTEC YouTube TV. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalatu wassalamu alayka ya Rasulullah. والذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كان من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. This is one of my best verses, which I love very much. I am Associate Professor Imtiaz Yusuf. I'm in charge of this series on Islamization of Knowledge series at ISTEC lecture series, which is titled Under Futures of Integration of Human Knowledge and Civilizational Development. Let me, before we begin the talk, Professor Aslam will be talking for about 50 minutes. Let me introduce our Professor Aslam, Mohammed Hanif. Actually, maybe he doesn't remember. I heard him many decades ago, and I said, this man is a very great intellectual. So I was always looking for his publications and I followed them. And then in in 2011, I did a special issue of American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences, and I invited him to contribute an article. Maybe he remembers that one. So I look and a very vibrant mind, a dynamic person, dynamic mind. So today he's going to talk about Islamization of knowledge as an intellectual agenda, critiques, challenges, moving forward. Moving forward. Again, let me repeat this again. Professor Muhammad Aslam Muhammad Hanif will be talking about Islamization of knowledge as an intellectual agenda, critiques, challenges, and moving forward. Let me introduce Professor Muhammad Aslam Muhammad Hanif. He is a PhD and a currently professor at the Department of Department of Economics at the International Islamic University in Malaysia. He got his PhD from the School of Development Studies, University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom, and he was a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, Georgetown University in the United States from September to October 1996. And he was also a Commonwealth Fellow at the Oxford Center of Islamic Studies in Oxford, United Kingdom in 1999 to 2000. He has, as I said, published many books and articles and conducted various researches in the area of Islam, economics and development, as well as Islamic economics, education. And he has a long list of publications. I'll just mention a few. He was the co-editor of Islamic Economics, Principles and Applications, which was published by ISRA in 2018. And also the co-author of the Foundations of Islamic Economics, published by IIIT very recently, this year in 2022. His current research interests are in philosophical issues in economics, socioeconomic impact of caste, social economics, and finance. He sits on few academic journal editorial boards, including International Advisory Board for the American Journal of Islam and Society, whose former name is American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences. He is on the executive member of the International Association of Islamic Economics from 2011 until now, and also on the International Council of Islamic Finance Educators from 2014 to 2018. And a member of the Afin Islamic Funds, which is Islamic related to Islamic Bank, Afin Bank here, from 2001 to 2014. PMB Investment Berhad 2016 to until now, member of the Board of Management of IIIT East and Southeast Asia since 2019. He is a co-founder of iTajir, an Islamic microfinance program targeting B40 community implemented since April 2018. So I hand over to Professor Aslam to present his lecture on the topic Islamization of Knowledge as an Intellectual Agenda, Critics, Challenges, and Moving Forward. Professor Aslam.
Thank you very much, Prof. Imtiaz. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-anbiya'i wal-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Our moderator, Prof. Imtiaz, Prof. Abdul Aziz, Prof. Osman, our teacher, Prof. Fathi, and brothers and sisters who have joined the session. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me just share my screen with everyone. I hope it works. Okay. Okay, before I start, let me just say that I'm very honored and pleased to be invited to give this fourth lecture in the series. I have been very much, I would say, part of the group of people that have been exposed to the idea of Islamization of knowledge ever since I was an undergraduate at the IIUM. And therefore, in a way, this has, colored my views. I'm just wondering, Prof. Imtiaz, am I still, is it still visible? Am I still on?
Yeah, you're on. You're on.
Yeah, because I lost the, okay, let me just get back to this. Okay, yeah, this would, if I go large, then I don't see anybody, but okay.
Yeah.
So I've been a participant in the evolution of the Islamization of knowledge agenda. Well, almost 40 years, and from a student, and then joining as a member of the staff of the university, and of course IIUM has been a major contributor to this agenda for the last easily 30 years, and therefore I've been involved also in trying to translate the ideas into the education curriculum of the university. So I'm very happy that we are having the series, and that I'm able to contribute in a small way. So I've chosen the title Islamization of Knowledge as an intellectual agenda. And I want to focus on some of the criticisms that have been leveled against the IOK agenda. Some of the challenges that I think need to be addressed. And by addressing those challenges, hopefully we can talk about moving forward. What I will be trying to cover in this 45 or 50 minutes, and a brief intro and a brief recap of the IOK agenda, the why and what of the IOK, and then we talk about the critique, and maybe some recent developments in the last 10 to 15 years. Some challenges and moving forward, and then hopefully we can have some thoughts on is the IOK still relevant, and I'm hoping to get inputs from all of you, and then some concluding remarks. Now, a kind of a brief intro and a brief recap of the IOK. I think in the writings of our colleagues from the ISTAC of the past, I remember, if I'm not mistaken, it was mentioned that as far as as history goes, the Al-Quran and the revelation of the Quran is seen as an example of this Islamization process. In this case, of the Arabic language, that brought with it a new Islamic worldview for the Arabs. So, in other words, this process of Islamization has been connected directly to the revelation of the Quran. And I suppose as far as the language is concerned, and something that is very, very central to our discussion of Islamization, i.e. the worldview, I think this is a very important point that is being raised. Yes, we are still talking about the Arabic language, but with the Quran, it has brought a new worldview. Yeah, so I think central to the process of Islamization of knowledge, and if you're talking about the specific disciplines that all of us are involved in, then this issue of the underlying worldview is very, very central, and definitely is part of that Islamization effort that has been going on for the last 4 decades. And if you look throughout the history of Islamic civilization, the critical interaction with others has been a central feature of Islamic civilization. Of course, this interaction is founded upon the Islamic worldview, and hence the subsequent Islamization process has always been an interactive one. In other words, Islamic civilization has never, just, been stagnant or disengaged. It has always engaged with others, and in that process, the Islamization process has taken place. And this Islamization process, of course, involves various levels. You can talk about, Islamization of the language. You can talk about Islamization of the worldview. You can talk about Islamization of, the disciplines that have been developed later. But what all of these examples of interaction with each other indicate is that there is a need for reform and renewal. So this idea of Islah and Tajdeed, I think, is part and parcel of where we could situate the Islamization of knowledge agenda. It's part of that call for reform and renewal. As far as the 20th century is concerned, while we may refer to the works of Allama Iqbal and Sayyid Abul A'la Maududi, the exact IOK terminology, Islamization of knowledge, and the detailed discussions, I think, are found in the writings of the two major proponents. In the 1970s, you have Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas, and in the 80s, we have Al-Marhum Ismail Faruqi and the Triple IT talking about what we are discussing today, the Islamization of knowledge agenda. Professor Al-Attas, I think the discourse that he makes is a much more philosophical one, and therefore you find that there isn't much, let's say, discussion about what he has put forward. It's in Faruqi's work plan, something that has always, the one that has attracted attention in that work plan has been, the 12 steps, and therefore it's sometimes called the 12-point plan. This was always the more popular version, and it was also the version that was the focus of the critiques that we're going to be discussing in a while's time. So Professor Al-Attas takes a more philosophical approach, and you'll be seeing some diagrams a bit later, and in this book that I had published a few years ago, I actually put a diagram for Professor Al-Attas, and I remember when I was discussing this with Professor Wan Muhammad Noor, while he kind of he agreed with the diagram, but he said, please just don't tell Professor Al-Attas that you put his ideas in the diagram, because he's not one to be keen on putting diagrams, opposed to to Ismail Faruqi, who was a very different kind of action oriented person. So he wanted to he even called it the work plan, right? So it was something that was meant to be implemented and to be translated into a program and to a university and so The 1980s and 90s period of progress for the Islamization of knowledge agenda, both conceptually and in practice. I think the IIUM being the main, you could say, the main focus of that practice. And by the end of the 1990s, there seemed to be an apparent plateau. And if you just go a couple of years after that with the 9/11 incident, you find that, you know, really there was a kind of you know, pressure on anything that talked about Islam, and in this case Islamization. Yeah? Hence, I believe this also is one of the reasons why later on, you know, we had a change of terminology. Islamization of knowledge became integration of knowledge. So it's a possible, I think, outcome of maybe you know, this political pressure as well. In the mid 2000s, there was a revival, and when I say revival, I'm also referring to, you know, to the fact that the triple IT, you know, started to have activities again after a few years of, you know, having to maybe slow down and you know, and lots of restrictions. But by the mid 2000s, we were moving again. And Prof. Osman, of course, you know, remember, he was very much active in the triple IT East and Southeast Asia office. But I think what had changed is this very different environment that we were in. Okay, so if the 80s and 90s were decades where you know, Islamization and, you know, Islamic everything was on the rise, I think by the mid 2000s you find you know, environment which was not necessarily supportive of you talking about Islamization, and therefore a much more hostile environment. And therefore, I think we needed to navigate, you know, in a different way. And this is why I believe in the 2010s, in the mid 2010s, there was this name change, yeah, from Islamization to integration of knowledge. Now, both are IOK. And as I will show towards the end, I really think actually that this term integration of knowledge does have a certain logic to it, right? But I would also argue that Islamization of knowledge is still a valid exercise. And maybe this is where some of the critics and the more recent developments, maybe we could have some discussion. I do believe that Islamization of knowledge is still relevant, but then integration of knowledge is probably also a very important part of this process. And we'll come to that maybe a bit later. Okay, now, why this IOK process? You know, both the proponents, the major proponents, and, you know, the authors who have written about this will talk about the backwardness of the Muslims and the Muslim nations. Marhum Faruqi used the term the malaise of the Ummah, from leaders to imitators. And as Dr. Hamid Abu Sulaiman al-Marhum would say, even imitating we couldn't do well. Yeah? So we are no longer leaders, we are followers, but, you know, even trying to copy and imitate, we can't do well. Okay? So I think that really gives you a picture of how maybe challenging the situation is in the Muslim world. Proponents of the IOK agenda all agree, and I think this is why we are talking about it as an intellectual challenge. They all agree that the central problem in the Muslim Ummah and the condition that we are in is caused by, you know, by our understanding and our appreciation of knowledge and in the education process. Hence, we also need to find the solutions in the realm of knowledge and education. And what are these issues? I'm sure all of us can, you know, we know it, or we can focus on it. It's about, for example, Professor Latas will talk about confusion in knowledge. Al-Faruqi will talk about duality of the education systems that we have in all Muslim countries. Yeah, so these are the things that we need to basically resolve. More specifically, the reason why we have to address this knowledge and education challenge is because modern knowledge and the disciplines that we teach all over the Muslim world, is born, developed, and exported to the Muslim world. These disciplines are not value-free, nor are they ideology-free. Okay, all modern disciplines, especially in the social or human sciences, taught in universities in the world, come from this 300 years, history, were born and have foundations that represent the Western European history and experience. Right? Both Alatas and Faruqi say the same thing, hence they are Eurocentric. So this is where
yes, we can see it. Just use it in this mode. I think it's okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. Well, yeah. All right. It's gone here. So basically, Eurocentric disciplines that we are having and we are teaching in our universities, and of course, this Eurocentric focus may not be in line with the Islamic worldview, and therefore this has implications even for the the policies that we may then bring out. What is the Islamization of knowledge agenda? Again, this is based on Professor Alatas and Marhum Ismail Faruqi. It's a program or agenda that will develop contemporary bodies of knowledge through a critical interaction or dialogue between modern knowledge or modern disciplines and our Islamic heritage, Turath al-Islami. I just want to point out that this critical interaction is not only of the substantive aspects of our disciplines, but it needs to also involve the foundations of those disciplines. And I think sometimes this aspect is forgotten. So a lot of the criticisms that will come later are because when there is an effort to Islamize, and in this sense, I have to, in a way, in banking and finance, we have to take a lot of the blame when people have a negative view of Islamization, because what is so visible in today's world is actually the efforts that are being done in banking and finance. And when people look at what is being done in the name of Islamic banking or Islamic finance, some of those things that are happening are very peripheral, and they don't give a convincing view that this is a genuinely Islamic enterprise. And yet the term is used, Islamization of the banking system or Islamization of the financial system. So the reason this happens is because the attempts, mainly in practice, have been taking the bank, trying to modify it without actually going to the foundations of that banking system. Yeah, so I think this is a very important point. The second point, that the critical evaluation is not only towards modern disciplines. It has to also be a critical evaluation of our Islamic heritage as well. This second part, I think, has maybe not been given sufficient attention. In fact, Professor Alatas, if you look at his works, he's talking about Islamization of contemporary knowledge, or what we have been maybe in IIUM talking about, the Islamization of acquired human knowledge. He doesn't talk about the Turath, and therefore we have to keep in mind that the IOK process involves both these two inputs, not only the modern disciplines, but also our own heritage. It is a critique of modern disciplines, as well as a critical self-assessment of our Turath from an Islamic viewpoint. Now, you may think it sounds a bit funny. How are we assessing our Turath from an Islamic viewpoint when the Turath is also supposed to be an Islamic output? Well, the mix of Islam and culture, the space-time dimension, requires us to re-look at maybe some of the things that we have considered in the past in our Turath and see whether these are actually still relevant or whether they are, need to be reformed as well. So I think the agenda coming under the name Islamization of Knowledge is much wider than initially would seem from the name Islamization of Knowledge. What is needed in this IOK agenda? And I think this is a very important point because, Professor Atas points to the issue of critical examination of modern science. We have to critically evaluate the concepts that we have in our disciplines, the presuppositions, or in economics, we may say the assumptions that we use, the symbols that we use, its empirical and rational aspects, and those impinging upon values and ethics. We need to have a critical examination of the theory of knowledge that we are there. So I think that if we understand that IOK involves these things that we need to do, it will have a significant impact on the way we actually develop our disciplines. We will be addressing the foundations, which sometimes are easily forgotten. Only by understanding these significant requirements can we then appreciate that IOK has to also critically address the foundations of knowledge. All right, and therefore, if I can put it in a very simple diagram, we want to develop those contemporary bodies of knowledge or disciplines, because I think generally most of us, we are in our own area. So like me, I'm talking about economics, and therefore we are talking about developing contemporary bodies of economics, of Islamic economics. And we will need the two inputs from the Turath al-Islami and modern knowledge. And I purposely don't necessarily say modern economics, because we may need to go beyond modern economics in order to develop contemporary Islamic economics. We may have to talk about political science, sociology, psychology, etc. Yeah? And we need to have a critical evaluation of both inputs and their methodologies, as given by Professor Al-Atas. So what is IOK? It is de-Westernizing modern knowledge and then infusing it with Islamic values and principles. This is taken from Professor Al-Atas. I'm adapting it. And according to Prof. Marhum Al-Faruqi, recasting modern knowledge by eliminating, amending, reinterpreting, and adapting its components according to the worldview of Islam. So there is some kind of sifting exercise that we are undertaking in order to make sure that the knowledge that we have today is in line with our worldview and the values and principles of Islam. Both the above imply that the focus of IOK is primarily an epistemological and methodological concern. So as Prof. Fathi was mentioning just now, we seem to be behind when it comes to this. We talk about Islamization of knowledge, and we've been talking about it for 4 decades. And if it is an epistemological and methodological concern, we have not maybe done sufficiently enough in this area. Okay, that it requires some sort of integration of knowledge based on our Islamic sources that is generated by modern social science and its sources and methods. Now, with this in mind, we can then appreciate Faruqi's 12-point plan. This is taken from that survey that I did. Look at the bottom part. The Islamization of knowledge has got these 12 steps, which has become a kind of a very famous reference point. And you can only understand these 12 steps if you put it in the context of it has to require methodological critical evaluation. It's not just talking about the economics discipline or the sociology discipline or any other discipline for that matter. It has to include the methodological discourse as well, which we probably have not done sufficient work on. Let's look at some of the critiques, and this is the first part is taken basically from the book that came out about 10 plus years ago. I've divided it into those who firstly dismiss IOK as a whole, and then those who are critical of aspects of it. Okay. Now, those who talk about dismissing IOK as a whole, there are two groups. One, I use the term negative, and these people dismiss IOK because they just consider IOK to be a waste of time, a waste of effort. I think in my book, I mentioned writers such as Bernard Lewis, maybe Bassam Tibi, and I think in economics, we have a few of them. People who just feel that there's no such thing as Islamic anything. All right. So, and they don't want to talk about this because they feel that it's just a waste of time and effort. You got those who also dismiss IOK as a whole, but I call them positive because they actually put forward alternatives to develop an Islamic science. So the first group doesn't believe that there is such a thing as Islamic science. And you would also put people like Abdul Salam, our physics Nobel winner, and so on. There's no such thing as Islamic science. But the second group, although they are critical of IOK, they are critical of IOK as a viable, let's say, agenda. They have their own, alternatives, but they do want to develop Islamic science. The second critique is those who are critical of certain aspects of IOK. Let's talk about the first one, the A1. They do not accept the premise of IOK that knowledge or science is not value-free. So they would probably say that, knowledge is neutral, science is subjective, there's no such thing as, Islamic whatever. Hence, modern knowledge and disciplines are acceptable. The task of Muslims is to master it and use it well. So it's basically follow the models of development as given, by the developed world, which are basically in the West. Muslims should embrace secularism and follow in the path of Western Europe. Now, the 80s, the 70s, 80s were also a period of very, let's say, harsh or hard views towards secularism. I think in the last maybe 10 or 15, 20 years, there have been people who have tried to argue that we may need to relook at different degrees of secularism. I know there's been some writing recently talking about moderate secularism. I think in the 90s, there were people who talked about distinguishing between secularism and laicism. And now people are talking about moderate secularism. So I believe there's an attempt to make us relook at this, but I think it's beyond this lecture to do that. This critique, that means the people who dismiss IOK and say it's a waste of time, I think IOK proponents don't really bother much. Maybe it's just not worth trying to argue, because I think this group has made up its mind that it's a lost cause, and therefore you don't find really anybody, trying to basically argue against them. Now, the second group, I think the second group is very interesting. They dismiss IOK, but they have their own alternatives. For example, and this is, I think, coming from even Fazlur Rahman, critical of the target of Islamization of knowledge, i.e. knowledge. Yeah? So he, for example, and many others, they feel that, ilm, knowledge by itself is good or neutral. The problem is its misuse and man's lacking responsibility that comes together with the power of having knowledge. Hence, they argue, it should be the human being and his moral priorities that should be the focus of Islamization, not knowledge. And I think he says somewhere, yeah, we had, especially the work plan is too enamored over making maps and charts of how to go about creating Islamic knowledge. What is needed, and I think I'm quoting exactly from Fazlur Rahman, are greater efforts in the creation of thinkers imbued with the Quranic minds. So the focus should be on the human being rather than on, knowledge. Now, and also he also views that, it's probably more important for us to focus on our own tradition first before we talk about modern knowledge. I think this point is maybe well taken, the idea of focusing on one's tradition is also something that Sheikh Taha Jabir Al-Wani Al-Marhum also talked about in his views of Islamization of knowledge. I look at it as, the same agenda, but maybe starting from two different ends. I don't think necessarily either one is right or wrong. It's just that you need prerequisites to do both. Yeah. Now, just on the point of this idea that you should be creating the people who are imbued with the Quranic minds. That means focus on the human being, not on knowledge or the discipline. I mean, the question that we could ask is, what does that involve? If you want to focus on the human being, it has to involve an agenda for the human being, right? And that agenda would have to be an agenda of, in the intellectual realm, in the area of knowledge, in the area of that discipline, right? So you can't run away. If you want to create these thinkers imbued with the Quranic minds, you will need to have an intellectual agenda that involves knowledge. IOK is, in my thing, I can't see what. IOK is patchwork. Okay, this is something that I think comes from Zia Sardar and his group of Ijmalis. I can't. Okay. This group basically says the IOK work plan mentions first principles, but then doesn't go beyond just mentioning them. It's not used in the effort to develop that body of knowledge. Faruqi's plan overemphasizes the modern disciplines. It's developed, and these modern disciplines are already developed within a certain worldview and framework. And therefore, trying to Islamize these disciplines is futile. You will end up making that body of knowledge that you're trying to develop into a derogatory position of minority sub-discipline status. So if you talk about Islamic economics and you work within the existing framework, you're not really going to develop Islamic economics. You're going to make it part of, a quaint little sub-discipline of modern economics. So you're not really developing genuine Islamic constructs. The task before the Muslim intelligentsia then is to develop, using the epistemology of Islam, alternative paradigms of knowledge for both the natural and social sciences that are most relevant to the needs of contemporary Muslim societies. So this was what was proposed by Zia and his Ijmali group in the 80s. And it would be interesting if we found out how he views these things today. I think he may still have this, but with a bit of a modification now. Now, I consider this second critique, the group that dismissed IOK but has had its alternatives, they have actually made some positive contribution. Why? Many of the modifications to the original work plan were actually made in response to some of these criticisms. All right, and I think the one wonderful thing about the Islamization of knowledge discourse is that it has been a relatively open discourse. I mean, if you think just of the American Journal of Islamic Social Science, which is published by the Association of Muslim Social Scientists, as well as the IIIT, Fazlur Rahman's criticism came out in the ages. right? And so too, many of the others who were critical of the IOK agenda came out in the journal. So they were quite open, and based on some of these criticisms, modifications to the work plan came out, right? I personally think that many of these criticisms arise because of the wrong way in which the IOK has been understood and the misunderstandings of the prerequisites for successful implementation. And I put a question mark because I think we need a little bit more work in this to carefully analyze those criticisms and to try to see whether this is the case. But I do believe that if you take Islamization of knowledge to mean just changing the periphery without going to the foundations, I think you may be right in your criticism. But both Almarhum Ismail Faruqi and Professor Alatas, I think both of them talked about the need for the foundations. Now, some of the works may not have been sufficient in discussing those foundations, but I think both of them had that in their writings. Especially, I would think Professor Alatas gave much more attention, maybe. It may be a bit unfair because, Almarhum Ismail Faruqi, unfortunately left us in 1986. So, maybe there was no time for him to be involved, after, in the debates that took place after that. In other words, just because you fail to produce textbooks, it may not be due to the agenda itself. It may be due to the failure to understand it. It may be due to the failure to give the results you want, right? But you don't necessarily blame the agenda itself. Yeah. So when people misunderstand the agenda and take shortcuts, you may not get the kind of output that you want. And I know in economics, we have had a big challenge trying to develop books and textbooks and teaching materials because people are not able to deliver something that you would be proud to say this is an example of a Islamic economics reference book, a textbook. Those who are critical of some aspects, I'm going to go through this very quickly because really they basically come from the main critics. The sequencing of the work plan, so Yassin Mohammed has that criticism. It's a short-term remedy. It's in IOK you are getting overexposure to the disease, and rather than being able to reform, you succumb to the to the modern discipline. We need to build Islamic bodies of knowledge first. Again, this is mentioned by Fazlur Rahman and also Zia. Yeah? Then you have internal critics, people like Luai Safi, Ibrahim Ragab, and many of them wrote in the Aegis in the 90s. And you will find that many of them actually contributed to what I would think as better versions of the original plan. They support IOK, they want improvements. The 12 steps are overwhelming and exceedingly complicated. When you look at the 12 plans, as given by Faruqi, you probably would think, how are you going to do all of that? Because the way it's given, it's like step 1, step 2, step 3. So it looks like one person is doing everything. Need for critical dialogue and creation of one methodology that is able to handle both the Turath and modern science and modern knowledge. Yeah. Now all of them have provided some modifications, and you can see in their writings. Yeah. Now more recent developments. Firstly, is Tariq Ramadan. In 2009, his book Radical Reform came out, and in that book he has, I think, in a couple of chapters, he talks about the attempts to Islamize knowledge or to Islamize disciplines, and he argues that he doesn't think that it has gone far enough. He feels that we end up doing what he calls adaptive reform, when what we actually need is radical reform, reform that is transformative. So he doesn't think that, what has been done in the name of Islamization has actually done enough. And he actually gives economics examples in that. Much of what he says, I would agree in terms of, his criticism of Islamic economics. I just wouldn't blame it on Islamization. And then we have Zia and Jeremy Hensel Thomas, who came out with a book in 2017, From Islamization of Knowledge to Integration of Knowledge. It's actually, I think the first part of it was actually reform in higher education, from Islamization to integration of knowledge. So these are the two, maybe works I'm going to briefly try to address. Tariq Ramadan's Radical Reform. IOK has not gone far enough. We're still, in this thing called adaptive reform. It has also manifested, Islamization efforts have manifested in rather rigid, overly legalistic presentation of Islam. And as I said, he gives example of Islamic banking. Unfortunately, he says Islamic economics, but I suppose for those of us who are in economics, we really feel as if we get hit from both sides. The bankers don't listen to us, and everybody else blames the economics discipline, when actually it's the banking and finance, areas that have not maybe wanted to adopt what we are talking about when we say Islamization. He calls for transformative or radical reform. Rather than talk about Islamic, the focus should be on the ethical. And I believe, in the last talk that Syed Khairuddin gave, he talked about this as well. He felt that we should be, looking at ethical alternatives. There is no Islamic economy, according to Tariq Ramadan, but there is an Islamic ethics for the economy. And therefore, what we need to be spending time on is developing that Islamic ethics that will be applied to the economy. Somebody who is in economics, I may not agree with this view, because I do believe that there is something that we could call an Islamic economy. In the 80s, there was a big debate. Should we call it Islamic economics, or should we call it economics from the Islamic perspective, from an Islamic perspective? So I do believe that we could have a system that we call an Islamic economic system. Just as we had, we have a capitalist system or a socialist system, we could have an Islamic economic system with its own philosophical foundations, with its own operational principles, with its goals and means to achieve this. Yeah? So we probably need to spend a little bit more time in this discussion. He talks about the need to bring qualified people together in order to produce that Islamic ethics for the economy. And I'm just giving this example. So what he calls the ulama nusus and the ulama waqi together. I think the Islamization of Knowledge work plan actually does this. And therefore, there is an effort to bring, those who are trained in the heritage together with those who are trained in modern disciplines together. And therefore, again, maybe the argument is that you've not done enough, or the means of interaction are not radical enough, or with a clear, aim of what you want to do. So that may be another argument. Yeah. As far as Zia and Hensel Thomas are concerned, I think it's interesting because the 70s and 80s discourse, when Islamization of knowledge was brought forward, I agree. The context has changed tremendously today. Yeah, there is criticism of mainstream social science that is global. In fact, in economics, I would probably be the first to admit that sometimes the critique of modern neoclassical economics is actually more profound from other schools of thought in modern economics than from Islamic economics. Yeah, so yes, over the last 40 years, there has been a lot of heterodox views or alternative views coming. The crisis in education is not only a Muslim issue, as maybe the scholars wanted to address in the 70s and 80s. They talked about it, as a Muslim country, Muslim nation, ummah issue. But actually, this crisis is again global. So we need a reform project, according to them, called integration of knowledge rather than Islamization of knowledge. This project would involve rethinking disciplinary entities and a new mode of thought to integrate revealed knowledge with acquired human knowledge. So that's what Islamization of knowledge, as it was known in the 80s, in Faruqi's work plan, is all about. This idea of creative synthesis, I believe. Yeah? And I believe Prof. Osman used this terminology when he made his presentation, the word synthesis, right? Need a new paradigm rooted in Quranic worldview and an epistemology based on Tawheed, which is also what was mentioned in the 80s critique of Islamization, but now to be called integration of knowledge. Now, what does this entail? We may be reforming existing disciplines. We may be inventing new disciplines. So in that sense, I like, again, Prof. Osman, in one of his earlier writings, he talked about the need to reclassify knowledge. So, certainly inventing new disciplines, which are interdisciplinary, maybe even transdisciplinary. These would be interesting things that we talk about. Working in conjunction with current knowledge. So that interaction is still taking place, right? You create new methodologies and new paradigms, and this is an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary effort. Okay, so now with those recent developments and some of their views, what are the challenges of operationalizing this IOK, and how do we move forward? I think some of the queries and the criticisms that have been made just require us to restate what the IOK agenda is. Yeah? The IOK agenda calls for engagement. It calls for interaction. It is not exclusion. It is not disengagement, right? We want to engage with others. The ultimate aim is to develop contemporary bodies of knowledge that represent an Islamic perspective or Islamic perspectives. To do this, we need inputs from both heritage and modern economics. I think everybody agrees on this. Both inputs need critical evaluation, and then, to use the term that Faruqi used, creative synthesis. So the first challenge is that IOK calls for critical engagement. It is inherently, from a definition point of view, inclusive. All right? Now, I think our challenge, whether it's in ISTAC, whether it's in other countries, Muslim countries, how do we create this engagement culture between the heritage scholars and the modern knowledge scholars? Now, Prof. Imtiaz mentioned, we've known each other for many, many decades. And I remember in the early 90s when I came back from my PhD, at that time, the Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge and Human Sciences, they had a very active engagement culture series. It was a discourse, and I remember it was attended by scholars who came from the Islamic Revealed Knowledge division, as well as the Human Science division of the Kuliah, and it was almost weekly. Yeah, I used to be one of the few who used to come from economics and attend some of those discussions. So we really have to create this engagement culture. Again, with all the developments that have been happening in universities over the last 10 years, it's not easy. So really, I appreciate sessions like this, which allow us to talk about topics like this. So that's challenge one. And this is something that Ibrahim Ragab wrote in 1997. He talked about creative engagement, right? So the Islamization of knowledge has always been engaging with the other, mastering modern social science scholarship, but then analysis of the historical development of that social science, taking stock of the general framework of the Islamic worldview, appraisal and rigorous critical assessment. So the process is actually being stated by scholars, right? But somehow or other, we, in the effort to make it a wider agenda, we're not able to do this, right? So Prof. Fatih, I think, was talking exactly about this. How do we, develop these in practice, right? 1997, Prof. Ibrahim talked about this. IOK is primarily meant for academics and scholars, right? Because who is the one that's going to do that engagement? It's not our students. It's not the undergraduate student that we're going to tell them about IOK. It may just be something that we tell them for knowledge purposes, but the actual Islamization of knowledge is done by academics. So it is an agenda for academics. And you need qualified scholars to do this, right? So if you have people who are coming from a modern discipline, no qualification or knowledge of Islamic heritage, and you expect them to come up with a textbook on Islamic economics, you're not going to be able to get something that you will be satisfied with. Or if somebody is coming from the Department of Fiqh and Usul Fiqh but has no knowledge of economics, how do we expect him or her, to come up with, Islamized body of knowledge that can be called Islamic economics? So we need qualified scholars. It's a prerequisite, all right? Despite 4 decades of discourse on Islamization of knowledge, I believe the modern scholar, traditional scholar divide is still a reality. And maybe I will even say, even in the IIUM, it's a reality. The university in which is supposed to be developing this integrated scholar, I think we still have the divide even there. What more in other universities where the idea of integration or Islamization is not something that is part and parcel of the university framework? Yeah? There is a need to create a new breed of scholars. Those who have mastered both the modern discipline and the Islamic heritage and are comfortable with both. Now, this is a major challenge. Someone like me, who maybe is more in economics and has some knowledge of the heritage, but maybe I may not be able to do as much as somebody who really has taken, 1 degree in economics, another degree in the Turath, and masters in economics, and the masters in Turath, and then they've had. You need people like this, right? That are able to represent the integration or the kind of scholar that we would like to have. So we want to have that contemporary bodies of knowledge. We want to integrate Turath and modern knowledge, but we need to remove the dichotomy in scholarship. It requires a new breed of scholars. In the IIUM, many years ago, well, not many, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, we had an attempt to introduce a postgraduate diploma in integration of knowledge or something like that. Yeah. The idea was to have a postgraduate degree or diploma that actually did this integration. And it would involve people both from the Turath as well as modern knowledge. I remember when we had that first class in the semester, I had participants who were lecturers from the Department of Fiqh, Usul Fiqh, as well as engineering. And it was quite a challenge trying to deliver this integration of knowledge to an engineer and a fuqaha. Very challenging. But we need to remove this dichotomy in our scholarship. Knowledge in both inputs are 2. So when you want to develop this qualified scholar, it's already difficult because you have the modern scholar and the traditional scholar. But we also have to remember, in our own disciplines, you have the substantive knowledge, you have the methodological knowledge. Okay? We have, and I say we means those in the social sciences, at least in my training and in the training of many others that I know, very rarely we get exposed to the history or the methodology or the philosophy of our discipline, let alone that of the heritage. Okay, and if you are coming from the tradition of let's say the heritage, the Islamic rival knowledge, you are compartmentalized. You, even if you do study the history and the methodology, it will be of fiqh. Very little is done in the other aspects of the heritage, right? So this lack of exposure is a major problem that doesn't enable us to have these qualified scholars. Very few academics are exposed to the philosophical dimension of their modern disciplines or even of the Islamic heritage. There is an over focus on the legal dimension, right? And I think many people have argued this is a major challenge, right? Everything is narrowed down to a discussion of fiqh, understood as law. Okay. Now, without the focus on the philosophy of our disciplines and the history of our disciplines, on the intellectual tradition of Muslim scholarship as a whole, it would be quite futile to hope for genuine Islamization of knowledge, and of course those Islamic textbooks. Yeah, so we need to be able to do this. Are we doing this? Okay. Now, in Appendix 1, in the original work plan, a little book that came out in 1982, there was an Appendix 1 at the back, or was it Appendix 2? I think it was Appendix 1. Appendix 2 were those who attended the workshop in Islamabad. But in Appendix 1, there was a kind of an assignment that was given in which the scholars in that discipline were asked to, your own discipline, you have to write the history of that discipline and understand the points in the history where there was a methodological shift, a change of a school of thought. Yeah, it was a fascinating assignment. And I think that's exactly what we need to do for our academics today. I mean, if somebody was to want to really develop Islamic economics, you would need to know the economics discipline, the history of the economics discipline, and to understand the schools of thought and the methodological schools of thought in economics, because you have many schools. Similarly, you would need to be exposed to our tradition in the Torah, the different positions taken by different scholars and schools of thought, if we do have. The law, discipline, we are quite aware of the 4 schools of law. But in economics, nobody talks about schools of economics, of Islamic economics. But we know that in economics, in modern economics, you have different schools of thought. So I think there is much more urgency that we have to talk about a critical analysis and survey of our own disciplines, in a way that will expose us to the history, methodology, and philosophy of our disciplines. All right, so we want to develop that, and I'm giving economics as the example. We use the Torah, we use modern knowledge. We want to bring these two together, creative synthesis. Each of them have substantive knowledge and methodological knowledge. We need to be able to master both, right? So knowledge in both inputs is of 2 kinds, substantive and methodological. So the third challenge is our academics need to be exposed to this. And I don't think we are doing it at the moment, not sufficiently anyway. Is Islamization of knowledge still relevant? I think I gave my answer in the beginning, so let me just, repeat some of the points and to add some. I believe much confusion still exists as to what IOK really means, its implications for curriculum, as well as academic human resource planning. And by this, I mean, in all our departments, when we are planning for our future generation of scholars who are going to continue, do we keep in mind the Islamization of knowledge agenda and the need to have scholars who are having that integrated perspective of things. I know in economics, generally speaking, if you're in Department of Economics, we want somebody who has got the first degree in economics, master's in economics, PhD in economics. And you know, I think this would maybe not serve our purpose. We may need to be thinking about how we can, you know, get people who are mastering not only economics but also the Torah. Similarly, in the Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge, somebody may have a first degree in fiqh and usul fiqh. What do you do for the masters? Yeah, is it able for you to? Are you able to expose somebody, you know, to a human science? We had that program for a long time in the undergraduate level through the major and minor requirement. If you were in IRK, you had to do minor in human science and vice versa. That doesn't seem to have continued. Yeah, so I think that's important. The target of IOK is modern contemporary knowledge. Now, when we use the term Islamization of knowledge, we are actually referring to Islamization of modern or contemporary knowledge, or as Professor Kamal puts it, acquired human knowledge. So that's the target of Islamization. Okay, I think Professor Latas is very clear because he talks about Islamization of, I think he uses the word contemporary knowledge. Okay, but I think Ismail Faruqi's 12-point agenda, because he has the Torah there, he has the modern knowledge there, it kind of gets mixed up because somebody is wondering, are you going to Islamize the Torah? Are you going to Islamize fiqh and usul fiqh, you know, knowledge? So maybe the term Islamization of knowledge needs to be given its correct place, right? Now, if this is what you mean, that Islamization is something that you do to the modern knowledge or to the modern disciplines, then it's very similar to what those who are involved in decolonization efforts, yeah, or the indigenization of knowledge efforts. We've had, I believe, even some talks from ISTAC talking about this. I think Islamization of knowledge would be very similar to that. The knowledge that we get come from our colonial masters. We need to decolonize this body of knowledge. So Islamization of knowledge in that sense is very similar. Now, you may say that we've not done enough, okay, that we've not been able to go beyond certain, yeah, I may agree with that. But I think Islamization of knowledge is a valid agenda. Over the last 6 to 7 years, Islamization of knowledge has become integration of knowledge, right? And is this a problem? And I would say actually it's not really a problem. Now, let me tell you why, because, you know, I've been trying to figure this one out. And thanks to what we've done in IIUM, especially in the Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge, I'm able to explain this, yeah? And I'm trying to work it out in the new edition of the survey that I've done on Islamization of knowledge. Now, we want to develop that contemporary body of knowledge. It's a task for us as academics, as you know, scholars who are in the university, and we need to be qualified, right? Now, what is it that we need to do? Firstly, modern knowledge needs to be Islamized. Turath al-Islami in the IRK terminology needs to be relevantized. Okay, so you're doing different things to these two inputs. So when in the work plan, under Islamization of knowledge, the modern knowledge is there, the Turath is there, it may be a little bit confusing. Yeah? So if you go to some of the modifications that were done later, for example, when Loai Safi talked about his parallel tracks, right? One track for the human sciences or social sciences, one track for the Turath, then it's easier for us to see that you are doing different things to each of them. Modern knowledge is Islamized, and that is what Professor Latas says. He doesn't talk about the Turath al-Islami much. And in IIUM, we say we want to relevantize. Others may say contextualize or, you know, other terms. But you are basically not doing the same thing for both. But you can't just leave it at that. You need to bring them together, right? Creative synthesis. And so what do? You bring these two together to develop the contemporary bodies of knowledge. And this I would term as integration. Okay, so IOK is still relevant, whether you're talking about integration of knowledge or you're saying Islamization of knowledge. Is just where are you referring to, right? I would think that, as far as modern knowledge is concerned, Islamization is still relevant. Okay. Sorry, what is this? Hence, Islamization of knowledge is still relevant for the task related to modern disciplines. Even if we say we should focus on the Islamizer, as Fazlur Rahman said, creating the Quranic minds. How will you do it? It requires a knowledge agenda. And Fazlur Rahman, in his alternative, actually has a knowledge agenda. He starts with the Torah, yeah, but it's a knowledge agenda. Okay, how do you change the individual? How do you change the mind of the individual? It needs a knowledge agenda. Using terms like ethics and ethical principles, people are talking about the need for ethics. It may not be sufficient to develop bodies of knowledge that proceed via Islamic epistemology and then to call it Islamic. In economics, there is one of the pioneer Islamic economists, Said Haidar Naqvi. He talked about this issue of ethical economics, because there's been quite a long-standing tradition of people who want to talk about ethical economics. But he argues that Islamic economics is not just any ethical economics. It is a religion-based ethical economics. It is an Islamic-based ethical economics. If you just say ethical principles, I don't know whether there is actually sufficient common ground to go into the details. So I would think that even if you wanted to argue on from an ethical point of view, you still need to be able to rationalize it from an Islamic perspective. In other words, you must still go back to your sources of knowledge and to be able to justify that. Yeah? So I welcome the idea of talking about ethics rather than just always focusing on the law. But I think, unless somebody has another view, I believe we still need to say this is coming from the Islamic point of view. I give you two examples. In our own ICOL, in the 90s, they talked about harmonization of law. I think we can understand it's a little sensitive to talk about Islamization of law. And therefore, they talked about harmonization of law. And I remember there was a long discussion. Harmonization based on what? What's your reference point to harmonize? Okay, so you would say, well, it has to be the principles of Islam, yeah, or the values in Islam. Yeah, so you can use harmonization, you can talk about ethical, but I think you need to be able to show that ethical economics is religion-based. And when you argue, it must also be in line with your views that you get from an Islamic viewpoint. Okay, I'm coming to the end. IOK must demonstrate genuine interaction and engagement between the ulama nusus and the ulama waqi'. This is Tariq Ramadan's term. However, this engagement, and this is where if I read him wrongly, my apologies. I feel that if you just bring the traditional scholar and the modern scholar and put them together, I don't know whether that's going to be able to give you any productive output, because they are literally speaking different languages. We've had this in economics, where in the West, they tried to bring theologians, Christian theologians and economists. There were many meetings. And in those couple of books that came out from that meetings, the conclusion was, both groups were speaking in literally different languages. They couldn't see eye to eye. So I believe that if you want to bring modern scholars and traditional scholars together to discuss about integration and developing those alternative bodies, the engagement must involve scholars who also have some knowledge of the other. So if you want to talk about ulama nusus, they must also have some knowledge of the contemporary knowledge. Similarly, modern scholars need to have some knowledge of the Quran. So we need ideally people who are coming out from the Kuliah of Islamic Review Knowledge in the bachelor's degree with the major and minor. These would be the people ideally set to do that critical engagement. Okay, and if you look at Loy Safi's modification of the Islamization of Knowledge work plan in '93, you already have this. You have the modern scholar, you have the legacy, all right? And then in the square, they are mastering the substantive knowledge, they are mastering the analytic and synthetic techniques, they are writing their textbooks, and then there is a critical review by the Muslim scientific community. So there is a bringing together of the ulama nusus and the ulama waqi'. And only after that, you can say the ijma, number 4, do you have something that you would call Islamized knowledge? So there is already that interaction. You may argue and say, well, not enough is done. And I would have no problem with agreeing to this. Yeah. So concluding points. Notwithstanding our applied areas of interest, the IOK must be understood as primarily a foundational concern or an epistemological and methodological concern. Yeah, but it cannot just talk about the theories, but it must also talk about the methodologies that went in developing those things. The critiques of IOK have made an important contribution to the IOK agenda, as many modifications to earlier versions of Faruqi's work plan are a response to these critiques. To operationalize IOK, academics must acquire prerequisites, especially in the foundations of both the heritage and modern disciplines. In substantive knowledge, exposure to wider fields of knowledge is needed. In other words, it cannot just be economics, economics, economics. It cannot be fiqh. It may need to be modified. And this is why, when the Kuliah of Economics, Department of Economics, when we introduced our double degree many years ago with IRK, I was very clear. I didn't want it to be with the Department of Fiqh and Usul Fiqh. I wanted our economic students to get their second degree in Islamic revealed knowledge and heritage, not in the Department of Fiqh and Usul Fiqh. I wanted them to also take courses from Department of Quran and Sunnah, in Department of what's your third? Usuluddin and Comparative Religion, so that they understand the Turath in a bigger way. Yeah, unfortunately, this couldn't continue. I hope it can continue. We need continuous education programs and engagement culture between relevant ulama nusus and ulama waqi'. These are some of the references that I have used in the talk. And I love to end with this. I think I end it in nearly all my lectures on this topic. People say that we've been talking about Islamization of knowledge for the last 35, 40 years. Where is the output? Okay. And I remember I asked this question to Professor Latas in the early to mid 90s. So that would have been about 15 years after Islamization started. Now it's 40 years. This is what he had to say then. If we do it correctly, meaning to say if we do Islamization of knowledge correctly, it may take, or it will take, at least 2 generations to achieve our goals. Okay, if we do it correctly, and I'm very sure when he said it, he was of the view that we were not doing it correctly, right? that there were lots of challenges. So what is these 2 generations? I don't know. I always thought it was 60 years, 30 years for a generation, but it may be 25 now. But whatever it is, I don't think we need to panic. I don't think we need to worry that, that we haven't shown anything or any results. I think in scholarship, it takes time. We need to create the people. So I would agree with Fazlur Rahman. We need to create those scholars who are able to do that integration. But we need a knowledge agenda. And I think the Islamization of knowledge agenda has its place, and the integration of knowledge agenda, brings the two together. It has its place. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be anyone else except us in IIUM that really represent this, because you can't go to University Malaya or UKM or any other university. They have their own priorities. Our university has as its mission Islamization, integration. It should be us that leads the way. Thank you very much, Prof. Imtiaz. I'm sorry I may have gone a little bit over time. Wallahu alam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much, Professor Aslam. Very, very rich and full of things for us to ponder and also things for us to criticize. I want to make a few comments before I open it and go to the questions. I appreciated your sticking to the 1982 version of Islamization of Knowledge book, and that is the classic, which I also always refer to. And you're right, I also face it in my teaching that our students, nor our syllabuses or curriculums in IIUM focus on the philosophy and the history and critique of the sciences, social sciences or natural sciences. So you are very, very right in that. So, one last comment before I open it up is that the question about legalism, in my view, the legalism of IOK started after Farooqi. After Professor Farooqi passed away, and IIIT had to relook for its foundations, and it started talking about that. Now, let me have my dig at Ziauddin Sardar. Professor Farooqi told him, I always have a dig with Ziauddin. Professor Farooqi told him, and you are exactly right, that Professor Farooqi said that I don't want to reinvent the wheel. And I think that is the point you very well put, that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. The wheel of Boeing 747 is already there. How can we make it better? Okay, so I go to the questions. Our first question here is, what is the relationship between IOK and Maqasid al-Sharia?
Well, I suppose if we want to move away from the overly legalistic approach that seems to have, become the trend, I can say as far as Islamic banking and finance is concerned, it's true. I don't know about the other areas. I can't speak on the other disciplines. But if you want to move away from that, overly legal approach, then I do believe that this focus on the Maqasid literature is the way out. I believe just over the weekend we had IIIT had a online discussion on this, and Fahar Mesawi and Prof. Walid and Prof. Daud, they were talking about their new book, Reconstructing Sciences based on the Maqasid or something like that. And this is exactly what I think in their forward they talked about, that in order to avoid the overly legalistic approach, this was what made some scholars, the Maqasidi scholars, come up with their works. They wanted to to look at the bigger rich heritage that is there. So I think definitely if you want to talk about a more let's say a different approach to developing Islamized knowledge or integrated knowledge, the Maqasid literature can be a wonderful source to do that. I'm sure, you know, others are more qualified than me to talk about how they are actually connected. But I think that's what, you know, can be done.
Okay, Professor Fatim Al-Kawi has a question, so I'll let him speak for himself.
Prof, you can't answer questions. You have to answer questions, Prof. You're going to ask questions, okay?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Professor Imtiaz. Thank you very much, Professor Mohammed Aslam Hanif. I think this is one of the best presentation that I ever saw. It is an insightful, revealing, fair, objective, holistic presentation and evaluation at the same time. So thank you very much for this. I think one of the major points that I need to address here, that integration of knowledge was not presented as an alternative to Islamization of knowledge. So I don't think that what Dr. Sardar has mentioned in the book as a title, moving from to, that fair enough to describe at least IOK, Islamization of knowledge, as an agenda, intellectual and cultural agenda. If you look carefully at what Professor Ismail Farouqi has mentioned in the first book, Islamization of Knowledge, and what Dr. Abdul Hamid has mentioned, they were talking about Islamic methodology of doing things. What is Islamic methodology? It is the integration of knowledge. So that's very easy conception of the idea of the relationship between integration of knowledge and Islamization. It is not something new. It is not a change which happened under political circumstances in the West about Islamic phobia and so on and so Islamophobia. And even in the Muslim world, there is some kind of Islamophobia. So this is one thing that I need to focus on, that it is Islamization of knowledge needs to think in an Islamic way. It's a methodology of the Muslim mind, how Muslim mind works and do things and bring things together and develop things together and so on and so forth. So this is an important issue that we need to address here and try to make sure that we are not regressing. They are not coming back from one program or agenda to another one. It is not different thing. That's one thing. The second thing, that many universities in the Muslim world now are developing programs of integration of knowledge. The same idea, integration of knowledge. Professor Hanif has mentioned that they are trying to develop a program, a diploma about integration of knowledge in economics, for example. That's something good, but the idea about the parallel between the two, the Turath and the contemporary knowledge, is still a problem. It is not sufficient to teach Turath in one side from one professor and contemporary knowledge in the other, and try to ask the student to do that. It is not the student task to do that. It is the qualified scholar who is required to do that first and try to teach this to student. That's why what Professor Hanif has mentioned about what we need about Islamization is a qualified scholars. Not to teach about, but to do that. So as it's very clear that Islamization of knowledge is easy said rather than done. So how can we do it? Unless those qualified scholars try to give examples of what Islamization of knowledge, what integration of knowledge looks like, we will not move ahead. So I think this is one of the priorities that we need to appeal to IIUM to try to move to this exact idea, is not to ask students to do their research using methodology of integration, but to ask the professor themselves to do that and bring some examples of how to do it. I think this is the challenge, the basic challenge that Professor Hanif has mentioned, and we need to do much work on that as a priority and urgent work now. Then we can move ahead with some sort of manual of how to do integration of knowledge. One other point about values, it's important to address the idea of values. I think we have three basic concepts that we need to relate to each other. Revelation, al-wahi, knowledge, contemporary knowledge, and human knowledge, and values at the same time. We cannot separate any of them. But how do we start? The Quran would always tell us that look, move, travel on the earth and see and develop ideas. So how do we do that? This is the way to acquire knowledge. Use our senses, use our mental abilities to create that knowledge, to develop that knowledge, okay, and as signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creation. It is one way, it is one thing, it is not two things. So creating knowledge according to revelation guidance is something integrated by itself. Of course, this is Islam at the end, Quran as the end, is an agenda of values. So it's not something different among these three concepts. When we do real work of understanding the revelation, we will understand the knowledge. We will not create or develop the wheel again. It is there, but how we perceive this knowledge, how we put this knowledge in Islamic perspective to be something that understand what is needed to be done about human civilization, contemporary human civilization, to save it from the evils that are embedded in it. So these three items, revelation, values, and contemporary knowledge, are integrated by nature. It's not something that we put in it from outside. It is there by its very nature. Thank you very much. I again commend what Professor Hanif has mentioned today. I think I will learn much more when I contemplate among what has he mentioned, and I hope that he is one of the best who can put an example of IOK in economics. Wassalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Professor Hanif. Just a couple of comments to Prof. Fathy. You know, this idea of integration is not a kind of replacement of Islamization. I think even Zia himself says this, it's not a replacement. I think he's talking about, you know, Islamization in its 70s and 80s, yeah, and then now maybe to him we need to talk about integration. Your point about it cannot be parallel, I agree 100%, because we used to have students, I told you, Bachelor of Economics students who used to then go to IRK and do courses there. And when we asked them about their experience, they said exactly that. It was like as if they were in two different worlds. In economics, they get a certain, a certain approach, subject matter, and even the way we teach it. And then they go to IRK, it's a different subject matter, it's a totally different, way of teaching and so on. And for them to put it together it's too much. So they end up getting just additions. not integration. So I really agree with you 100%. It is the role of the academics, the lecturers, to actually teach that subject matter in an integrated manner. And I think you are 100% right. We need to create people to do that.
Okay, we go to the question, why in 1970s Islamization of knowledge focused on social sciences and not natural sciences and engineering?
Well, I'm sure, Prof. Imtiaz, you are also capable of answering this. But I mean, the little that it's written in the literature. It's in these disciplines, in the social and human sciences, that you actually have, human beings, ethical values, and so on. And hence, you would naturally start with those disciplines first. But I do believe that, later on, very quickly, it actually went across to all disciplines. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Association of Muslim Social Scientists came after the Association of, is it the medical or the engineers or something like that, right?
Yeah,
So
engineers
right.
and medicals, yes, that's right.
So, yeah, but the IOK, yes, they focused on the social and human sciences first.
Yeah. The question from Dr. Professor Noor Farida Manaf. Professor Faruqi argues for a balance between empowering ourselves with Islamic knowledge and Western knowledge. But I feel we do not engage in Westernization of knowledge, be it analyzing it critically or in appreciating where it's due. What do you comment on it?
I mean, I think she means Western knowledge, right? I mean,
Yes,
we
yes.
don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, because for example, if I take economics, most students who will go and study economics in any university, they would be given the standard economics textbook, which would be one school of economics, neoclassical economics, and there would be no critical discourse at all. You would just take whatever is stated there, and you would take it to be the truth. And then when you come back as a lecturer, you teach the same thing, right? So hardly any real critical analysis of that body of knowledge. And this is why, if you look at the work plan, one of the steps would be to do that critical survey of the discipline, of your modern discipline. And so, you need to understand where that discipline is coming from. Why did it have this particular, approach and methodology? Were there certain parts of that history of that discipline where it made a change? So, for example, in economics, what were the factors that led to, let's say, the classical school dying off and being taken over by, let's say, the marginalists and later the neoclassical school? So and why didn't, for example, the Marxists or the more radical schools, why did they not gain a foothold? I mean, this is how we should be critically looking at our economics discipline, but it's not done. I mean, we go there and we just are taught one particular school and without any, query. And worse still, we come back and we teach the same thing to our students, right? And so how do you get out of it? So we need, I think, scholars who are willing to be critical of the disciplines that we are in, to know their history and methodology, etc. I would just add the same thing also for our Turath scholars, because I sometimes think it's easier for us to deal with being critical of modern sciences, modern knowledge. But I think when it comes to being critical of the Turath, this is maybe more challenging. I don't know if anybody else would like to make a comment on that, but I think that's a bigger challenge.
Okay, the next question is from a ISTAC PhD student, Ifat Majid. Is there a conflict with IOK and modern knowledge? Isn't modern knowledge supposed to be taking knowledge forward, actually make IOK more relevant to the modern world?
Yeah, I mean, IOK is a process. right? Modern knowledge is the product of a certain process, and therefore we want to subject that modern knowledge to an IOK process. So by critically evaluating it. I mean, there's no denying that modern knowledge has made tremendous contributions into, to society, to human civilization, but there are also shortcomings. And also, these modern knowledge, as I mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation, IOK proponents would say that this modern knowledge is not neutral. It's not value neutral. It's not ideology neutral. And therefore, we need to subject it to Islamization process, where we critically look at those values that are, they are not mentioned. I mean, and I give the example in economics, we assume, and it's taken for granted, that the individual economic man is a self-interested maximizer of utility. He's only interested in his own well-being. And is that the view of man that we need to have, that represents the Islamic view of man? So we need to critically evaluate, modern economics. So similarly for other branches of knowledge.
Yeah, this is just an opinion from one Umar that in Malaysia, 10 SPM program students learn Islamic knowledge and modern studies like biology, math, Arabic, Sharia together. So it's just a comment.
Yeah, because I think we've been doing this integration or attempts at modifying the school curriculum. So now we have many schools in Malaysia that are also teaching both religious subjects as well as modern subjects. So these are the schools that he's talking about.
Okay. Can you give academics living in Nigeria some suggestions about how to proceed on IOK, because and recommendations for people? I think the question is like this: is IOK universal? From what IOK suppose done in UK and USA and Southeast Asia, as we are engaged here, and in Africa. I think that is what is the crux of the question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think IOK is a universal agenda. Whatever we do and the end product is not meant to be only for Muslims. It's meant to be for all humanity. So in that sense, it is meant to be universal in that sense. However, I do believe that when it comes to the detailed application, then your local context, your local environment will also have an impact on how that Islamic, whatever discipline you are talking about, will be applied in your own communities. So there will be a fixed permanent input as well as a flexible time and space element. So you just need to figure it out. Contact your triple IT office in Nigeria.
Okay.
I know they are very active, so they could be helpful.
Okay, question from MEL. Surely the Arabic Latinized term Islamization is problematic. Ethics is sufficient. Overcoming the space-time issue in the context of revelation and human knowledge is the first steps in the process. It's just a comment.
I'm not too
Clear.
know whether I could give an answer to that. We are using English language, and so we use the word Islamization. Others use Islamicization, and all kinds of different changes. The Arabic term is Islamitul Ma'rifah, right? I think the word is Ma'rifah, not ilm.
Yes.
And I think that is maybe another area that and Dr. Fathi would be even better placed to talk about this. Why it's not ilm and why it's ma'rifah. But I think we are talking about acquired knowledge. Therefore, acquired knowledge is not absolute. It's not value free. It's value loaded. So the need to to do something to it.
Professor Fatih, could you say something about Ma'rifa?
You see, we have the problem with the word knowledge. It's an English word. And we equate knowledge with ilm. Well, that's wrong. Ilm is the ilm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ilm al-malaika, ilm al-anbiya, ilm al-insan, and even ilm, some kind of ilm with other creatures, which we don't know. But ma'rifah is something quality of a human being. That's the main difference. That in Arabic, ilm is a general term that encompasses all these things. But what we are talking about in Islamization of knowledge is the knowledge of the human being. Okay, we have turath, we have even nusus, but what our understanding of these nusus is our knowledge. So this is what we need to Islamize, our knowledge, even our knowledge of understanding the nusus. That's where Islamization of knowledge will fit into even the turath and even our understanding what Dr. Alwani would say, that islah and tajdeed within turath, with an understanding of the nusus. It's not just dealing with the waqi', with the contemporary knowledge, even with the under our own understanding, not of the heritage itself, but our contemporary understanding of the ayahs of the Quran. It might be different from understanding of the earlier scholars. That's where we need islah and tajdeed and reform and renewal, even with our own so-called Islamic knowledge. So that's the idea. Knowledge is about human knowledge. Ilm would encompass that knowledge and other kind of knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. There are lots of questions. I hope we can, I'll try to accommodate, say, we can go, say, over 15 minutes, Professor Aslam, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. No
okay. The question about critique of Turath, a question from MEL, that we are still stuck fighting about Mu'tazila, Shia, Sufi, and others. So how do we deal with this issue of critique of Turath and avoid it?
Yeah, we are Muslims, so that's what we do. So inshallah, we get some hidayah, and start thinking about the important things and our immediate priorities.
Okay. Okay. Let me go further. Scientific Aqidah from Masdi Nizam. Scientific Aqidah could be example of IOK, as Maurice Bucaille and Abdulaziz Majid Zindani. Do you think so?
I mean, I don't know. I haven't really given it a lot of thought, but when I first read the Science Bible and Quran, and I remember it was given by Prof. Kamal to us, and we had to read and we couldn't really understand it at that time. But this idea of wanting to prove everything through science, I have a problem, because, and then just because something in the Quran seems to tie in with some scientific finding, and you say this means that the Quran must be truth because it's proven by science. I think that's a problem, right? Because what if then science changes, and then you get another reading, and then you so my view is probably this idea of trying to think that there must always be this verification or support from science could be problematic. I mean, but I have to say I have not really given a lot of thought to it, but it's just that I think we don't need to rely only on modern science to prove everything. We have different criteria of proof, right? So maybe we should try to think of how our scholars accepted statements. Some were through observation, some were through use of aql, but some were based on the Quran and the Hadith and so on. So, but I must say I'm not answering this question very well.
The question from Sharifa Nazira, she's a student here at ISTEC. I also heard about the word Islamization of knowledge. Is this the correct word? What is the difference between the two terminologies, Islamization and Islamicization?
This one, Prof. Kamal has to be here to talk about it. But I believe that the one of the issues is that Islamization means like converting to Islam, whereas Islamicization means that the word is Islamic. So you are making the process to make something Islamic. You know, I really don't, I prefer not to spend too much time, but I do know that Prof. Kamal also refers to the work of, is it the scholar who's based in France, Prof. Hamidullah, right? I think.
Yeah, Muhammad Hamidullah.
Yeah, so Prof. Kamal, I remember even when we were students, in the mid 80s, he mentioned this. I remember in our programs and saying that he preferred that, and also Islamicization apparently gave a view that is a bit more flexible. Islamization apparently connoted something which is a little bit more rigid. So he prefers Islamicization.
Okay, it's just semantics.
Yeah, but really he probably needs to be the one that gives the answer, and not.
Okay. This question from MEL, again, I'll try to see if we can get the gist of it. Praying as a Christian, Buddhist, or any other creed is not in Islamic if the prayer is directed to the idea of one God. The Islamic is bringing humanity to the significance of Tawheed as transcendence and safeguarding human dignity. Is it not? Yeah, it's a question about comparative religion, worshipping.
And this is your area. I mean, you need to take this question.
I would just say that, Allah Ta'ala subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we have one deen and different sharias, so we stick to that. And everyone Allah says in the Quran that He has made different ways for each other, and these differences should not be fought on. We should more be concerned about competing for good, fastabiqul khairat, and not engage in these issues. Leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He will decide it at the end. This is my response always, that we leave it to this, and we focus on on doing competition in good. Fastabiqul khairat. Otherwise, we get into a lot of issues of conflict. So I think that's all. Professor, anybody else has any question to ask? You can ask directly, direct to Professor Aslam. We still have 10 minutes.
Yeah, there's one, I think Bello talked about in Nigeria, to use the word Islamization.
Yeah,
may be quite challenging, and therefore, using another term. Really, like I said, as long as the substance of what you do is in line with what Islamization is promoting, how you present that to the community, I think that has to be using your own wisdom and knowing your own context. I think that's fine, and maybe this is also why there are these views. Maybe those who are in Western societies, to not use Islamization because of the
sensitivities.
Yeah, it gives just the wrong word, and so you come up with your own way of presenting that.
Yeah, this question here, the last one in the chat box is, what is the difference between IOK agenda and sacred science?
I hope Prof. Osman is not here, so he would be the perfect person. I mean, it's not possible for me to answer this question. Nuruddin always asks very difficult questions. So.
Okay. All right. You know him. That's always helps. Okay. Now there are many requests for your soft copy of your PowerPoint. Will you be able to share it with ISTEC, and then we share it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned, I'm working on this article that I want to be part of the edition that I'm doing for the book, the critical survey, because it's 15 years old. So and so I'm hoping to put it there, but I could, I suppose I could give the
working copy.
The working copy when I do that. Hopefully I will have the time, although, I told my student just now, theoretically I'm on sabbatical, but it has actually become sabartical. Yeah, in Malay, sabar means sabar.
Yeah,
because I have to teach, although I'm on sabbatical. So, so a lot of things were not done, including this chapter. So I'm thankful that I was able to present it, because then it kind of cleared up my own ideas on it. And so I just need to make it and put it down on paper. So inshallah,
So it's always very, very enriching to hear to Professor Aslam. Professor Abdul Aziz Bargut, I invite you to say a few words, Professor Abdul Aziz, as the end of the end of the session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Imtiaz. I think we thank our Professor Aslam for this very informative lecture. And in fact, this is the way and the trend that we want to enhance in ISTAC here. We look critically at the project of Islamization of knowledge, what we have achieved, and what is needed to be done in the present and in the future. I think that's very important. And from the discussion in the last 4 sessions or lectures and today, I see that we have another 40 years, inshallah, to go forward with the Islamization of knowledge, and that's really how things mature. Because if after 30 or 40 years we are still discussing about the operational definitions of the Islamization, means we haven't reached the level of the reproducibility of the model. Reproducibility means everywhere in the world, anyone wants to use the model, he has the tools, he has the method, he has the application, he has all this, and he uses them. And I think that's where we should head, inshallah. And it's really enlightening to hear from our prof today. And there will be more lectures on the way forward, the futures of Islamization and integration of knowledge, so that we put things together and see what we have done, and what is the missing link there, and we complement that missing link. Because I think after all this time, we still discuss the point whether we Islamize the person or the knowledge or the value system, or I think to me it looks very simple. It needs just an integrated mind to see that all are important, all need to be integrated, because you cannot do the one without the other, as Prof. Aslam was saying. And these are social phenomena, means it happens in a culture, in a society, in a context. So we need also the more we talk about the person or the personality, the Islamizer, we need to talk about the methodology and knowledge and education, because how do you nurture this educator? How do you nurture? If the whole Islamic system in the majority of Muslim countries is secular oriented, so you still have a question of the objectives of knowledge, the attributes of the graduates, the philosophy of education itself. We don't take only IIUM as an example, or even for that matter Malaysia or some Muslim countries who moved along this process, but talk about the majority and see how is the educational system. So I think what we heard today is very great, and the comment of Prof. Fathi also is very important. And I think, inshallah, we are on the right direction. And I hope, Prof. Imtiaz, along with your series of these talks, there will be a time where we can have an international conference on integration, futures of integration and Islamization of knowledge, and bring all the streams of thought and ideas, and let people talk about theory, practice, applications, and what we have accumulated, and then from there we move forward. So it's really great. I would like also to thank our participant here from Malaysia and from other parts of the world for their presence and support. With this, I thank you all. May Allah bless you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Professor Abdulaziz Barghouth. With his words, we come to an end of this session today by reading Surah Al-Asr.